everybody, welcome back, or for those of you that are new, welcome for the first time. My name is Susan. I am a freelance fiction editor and I specialize in science fiction, fantasy, and romance. With the release of Jennifer Armentrout's latest fantasy romance novel, I thought it might be helpful this week to talk about some of the different subgenres in romance that have to do with fantasy, what the differences are, and how you can tell for your novel or for your reading choices moving forward if you're interested in diving into those genres further. So for those of you that may not be familiar, Jennifer Armentrout is a great author who just published her third book in her fantasy romance series. The book is called The Crown of Gilded Bones. I highly recommend you check out the first book, From Blood and Ash. If you haven't, it's a ton of fun, and now you can read all three at once. Although I do warn you, the series is not complete yet. That should definitely not keep you from buying it, supporting the author. But I do know that readers like to know when series aren't complete because they want to rush to the end. In any case, as I mentioned, she has published book 3 in this fantasy romance series. But what does that mean, fantasy romance? What does that include? Why, if her book does, and a little bit of a spoiler here, so if you're going to read the books and you don't want this, pause or jump over this for a bit, or come back to it after you've read the books, there is an element of vampires and werewolves. Sort of. It's complicated. In any case, vampires and werewolves are more well known for paranormal romance, not fantasy romance. And she has a very, very strong external plot outside of the romance, so why isn't it just fantasy with romance elements? All of these questions are great questions and things that you should ask yourself as you are writing a book like this or as you're reading to figure out how to identify those types of things and what you might want to classify your books in the future. But the short answer is it's subjective. It's complicated, and it's a little bit of a gray area with a lot of crossover. So some books could be considered one way or the other depending on who you're talking to or what you're looking at. Some of it has to do with the components in the story, what's included, as well as the strategy, how it's being marketed, who the audience is, who's most likely to read it, to enjoy it, as well as who's publishing it. Depending on what publisher or imprint, that will also lead the way for whether it should be a fantasy romance or a paranormal romance. I know it seems like a bit of a thin line and you're like, why does this matter? If you're traditionally publishing, it's important because then you can know to target certain agents that are looking for that specific type of romance, as well as in your pitch letter directly tell them that you know it's a paranormal romance. So they may be more likely to pitch it to Avon, or it's a fantasy with romance elements. So they may be more likely to pitch it to Harper Voyager. Every bit of information you can give them that's targeted directly to the market is helpful for them to be able to see how they're going to sell your novel, how they're going to get you into the market, and who's going to buy your book. For those of you that are self-publishing, it's the exact same thing, it's just a bit more direct. Then instead of having to tell an agent or a publisher who's going to be reading this book, you are going to be directly targeting who's reading this book. So knowing this specifically, knowing if you're going after paranormal romance readers, if you're going after urban fantasy romance readers, if you're going after fantasy readers that just like a little bit of romance, those are very different categories, even though a lot of those readers cross over. And knowing that as you're going into your marketing, your publicity, even your just publishing strategy in general is very important. So with all that being said, there are some identifying factors to how you should classify your writing, your novel, or the novels that you're reading right now. So I thought it might be helpful to go through a couple of the different subgenres and some examples so you can see what I'm talking about and have an idea of what you're looking for as you write or as you're going through your comps, however you're moving forward with your publishing strategy. So obviously, since we're talking about Jennifer Armentrout's series, it's best to start with fantasy romance. So fantasy romance is obviously very aptly named, it is fantasy romance. But it is a bit more epic in scope and in world building. It has a very heavy fantasy plot component, obviously, but the romance plot is equal, if not greater than, that fantasy plot component, which is what makes it fantasy romance versus otherwise. The other big tell for fantasy romance is that it's generally a world other than ours that's more fairy tale or historical feeling, so castles and magic and princesses and princes and things like that. This is is not 100% always the case, but it is pretty on par with a lot of the fantasy romance, especially the fantasy romance being published in YA right now. So that is a pretty good indicator of the feel of the novel that will be expected in fantasy romance. So obviously Jennifer Armentrout is a perfect example of this for fantasy romance, as well as most, if not all of you, will probably recognize Sarah J. Maas. Very classic examples of fantasy romance where it has a very strong fantasy plotline, but again, that very strong, if not bigger, romance plotline that makes it that fantasy romance feel. In comparison with that, you have fantasy with romance. I know, it's a bit confusing because the terms are so close together, but the difference here is that the fantasy is leading the way. So it's a title that'll probably appeal to romance readers, fantasy romance readers, but the love story, while probably pretty strong, is definitely secondary to the plot. And by this I mean there are stolen moments, maybe it's an unrequited love that's going to take some time to build, things like that where you're focusing more on the moving plot, on different parts of the characters trying to solve a mystery or a murder or trying to take back the kingdom, then you really are them coming together and really building their relationship as a key component of that plot, especially in the first book. And again, most of these are series. Other than that, it pretty much matches in line with what fantasy romance is. Again, it's generally a more either otherworldly or historical feel, has lots of castles and knights and kingdoms and things like that. This isn't always the case, and we do need more outside of that. And the best example I can give to you of something that is a very strong fantasy but has some elements of romance is maybe something like The City of Brass. I absolutely loved this book. You watch this wild plot unfold, but there are just some small moments and there's a growing tension between two of the characters, and I won't tell you who. And you can sort of see that happen. So it's fantasy with romance elements. It is not a fantasy romance. And as you read this, and as you read Jennifer Armentrout's books or Sarah J. Maas or any of the other fantasy romance books out there, you'll be able to sort of see the difference, feel the difference, as well as City of Brass is set in a bit of a different time and place than your usual knights and princesses and castles and things like that, which was very refreshing and awesome. I highly recommend it. And it is a series as well. But as I mentioned in the beginning, Jen Armentrout's books have sort of vampires and werewolves. So aren't vampires and werewolves paranormal romance? What is the difference between paranormal romance and fantasy romance? Why are they two different things? Paranormal romance is usually more episodic than epic. It's also usually more contemporary than historical. While vampires and werewolves and magic can be a component within fantasy romance, generally they're not the focus. The focus is elsewhere. It's usually on the bigger plot, or it's on the politics. It's on sort of this bigger, more epic scope adventure that they have plotted out for you. The difference in paranormal romance is that those werewolves, vampires, things like that, they're usually the focus. That's usually the hook. So for example, in one of my favorite paranormal romances by Nalini Singh, she has a series called the Psy Changeling series, and it is focused on a pack of wolves, a pack of a variety of different types of shifters depending on where you come into the series. And it's more episodic in that way. Each book is about one partnership, one romance, and then while the world building and the story continues because there is a bigger arc over her series, it is very encapsulated in that one book and you move from one to the next versus Sarah J. Maas or Jen Armentrout's books where they are sort of massive in scope and it's a big series that's continuing this very complicated plot over these several books, however many that may be. In paranormal romance, as the name would suggest, the romance is the strongest part of the plot. So you have all of the other fantasy elements, you have the world building, but again, it's focused on that one couple that's built into that one book or a couple of books, but again, it's that more episodic, that more narrowed scope versus the wide view of a fantasy romance. But don't let that fool you. These are very complex series that sometimes go on for 5, 10, 15 books. So if you like complex world building, you can do fantasy romance or paranormal romance. It just really depends on how much you want to focus on the romance versus the other plot lines and the world building, as well as many times paranormal romance is more episodic, more one couple per book type of a feel. Again, though, not always. So then finally, the last subgenre fantasy romance category we're going to dive into is urban fantasy. Now this is technically not a romance category, it's actually a fantasy category, but so much of urban fantasy has romance in it, it really does sort of straddle the line to the point where I don't feel like you can have this conversation without it. So then urban fantasy is in some ways sort of the mirror image of paranormal romance, in the same way that fantasy with romance is sort of the mirror image of fantasy romance, which is it focuses more on the other external plots, the mystery, the fantasy world building versus the romance, while it still has those romance components usually, most likely, in it. Great examples of this, classic examples of this are the Anita Blake, Laurel K. Hamilton series, although that dives way more into the romance than I think people were originally expecting when that series started, as well as the Mercy Thompson, Patricia Briggs series. I could go into a variety of examples, but these two are perfect in showing that it starts out really focused on the supernatural politics, the world building, what's happening in the mystery or the murder plots, everything like that, while having those subgenre romance elements in it. Now, for these series specifically, especially, it does grow to be more of a romance as it goes, but the Mercy Thompson series, especially, Patricia Briggs was very careful to keep it relatively low on the romance scale. She really wanted you to focus on Mercy, the pack, and the inner politics. So that's something to keep in mind if you dive in and you absolutely love tons of romance and steam and everything like that. The Mercy Thompson series, their romance is beautiful. I absolutely love it. But a lot of it is off the page, so for a romance reader, it is a little bit heartbreaking. You always want a little bit more of Adam. So these are really the four main subgenres of fantasy romance, romance fantasy, urban fantasy romance that I would argue your book is probably going to fall under if you have some combination of those elements. It just depends on what your book's focus is and how it's leaning. And as you can tell, as I mentioned before, it's all very subjective. So for example, Jennifer Estep, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing her name correctly. Either way, she wrote a fabulous series called the Crown of Shards series. The first book is Kill the Queen. And this is what I would actually consider a fantasy romance book. The romance in it is very strong. I would argue it's equal to the plot. It's not greater than the plot, but it is equal to it. But it was published by Harper Voyager, so it was actually pitched as a fantasy with romance elements. Actually, it was pitched as an epic fantasy with romance elements, which I also sort of argue, but it's a phenomenal book either way. In any case, this is all sort of to show you that there isn't really a right or wrong answer, but it is something that you do want to consider carefully, whether you are looking at going traditionally published or indie published, because again, traditionally published, it's really going to help you target the right agents, the right publishers, how you want to move forward with your book, as well as knowing the comps and what's coming out so you know the competition. And on the indie side of that, again, the comps and the competition are still really important, but also this is going to help you know who's most likely going to be buying your book and who you need to target for all of your marketing and publicity, since you're going to be doing that on your own versus through a traditional publisher. Hopefully this has been helpful. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. As you can tell, this is a genre that I absolutely adore and read in all the time, so I would love to answer any questions that you may have. Don't hesitate to like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps the channel. And until next week, keep writing.